I have dressed 6 generations of Illyri brides, and I had never once needed a human. The veil came to me the way it always does, 3 hours before the rite, folded in its cedar box like something asleep. It had belonged to Vienna Thal's mother, and her mother before that, woven in the old bias cross pattern that no loom on the homeworld could reproduce anymore, because the loom that made it had been broken apart for scrap 2 centuries back. The lace was not lace, not really. It was thread laid over thread in a spiral nobody alive remembered the trick of, except that it held light the way water holds the moon, and it had held the light over the faces of every Thal bride for 400 years. It tore while I was steaming the creases out. I did not scream. I have been wardrobe mistress long enough that I have stopped screaming over fabric, even fabric like that. I simply stood very still and watched a handspan of antique lace open along an old fold line like a seam giving way in a hull, and I understood, in the quiet animal part of my mind, that the wedding would happen in 3 hours whether or not the veil was whole. I sent for the 7 registered court tailors inside the first 10 minutes. Master Orvith came first, then Savani, then the twins who do the formal robes for the military presentations, then 3 more whose names I will not bother you with because none of them mattered in the end. They were good. I want that said plainly. Because what happened after does not happen because the court tailors of the Hall of Vows are fools. They are not. They held the veil under the lamps and turned it and pressed their thumbs along the tear and told me, one after another, the same true thing. The bias cross could not be rewoven by machine without the new thread showing as a scar of light across the old, and no living hand on the homeworld still knew the spiral by feel. Master Orvith wept. He is a proud man and he wept anyway, because he had pressed that fabric for 40 years and he could not save it. It was my assistant, a young woman named Pell, who told me about the human in the mending deck. I knew of him only the way you know of a leak in a far pipe, a fact, not a person. He had come up through the lower berths 11 months earlier on a transport that should not have made it as far as it did, and he had been waiting, since then, for the Crown to decide whether his asylum petition would be heard or returned. While he waited, he was permitted to work, and the work he had been given was patching crew uniforms 3 decks down from anything that mattered. Pell said she had once seen him take in the cuff of a guard's tunic so cleanly, you could not find the old stitch line even holding it to the light. I did not believe a man who patched trouser cuffs could save 400 years of lace. I went and got him anyway, because I had nothing else, and because the alternative was telling Vienna Thal that her mother's veil would not be at her own wedding. His name was Idris Calloway. He was a calm man, somewhere past 40, with hands that looked like they had done a great deal of work they were not proud of, and a great deal more they were. He did not bow when I came in, because no one had taught him to, and he did not ask why a court official was standing in his doorway with her hands shaking. He just looked at what I was carrying. "May I?" he said, and held out his hands, palms up, the way you would ask to hold someone's child. I gave him the veil. He carried it to the light, the way you carry something that might still be breathing. He turned the torn edge under his thumb for a long moment, longer than any of the masters had taken, and then he did something none of them had done. He turned it over and looked at the hem. "There's allowance in here," he said. "Old hem, never cut down." "Same age as the rest of it?" I told him I did not know. "It'll be the same age," he said, half to himself. "Nobody throws good thread away when they're weaving with their own hands and it costs them their eyes." He found a seam ripper and a tin on his bench, old and worn smooth, and began, with no more ceremony than a man unlacing a boot, to take down 2 inches of hidden hem that had been folded under and stitched flat for 4 centuries and never once seen daylight. I asked him what he thought he was doing to a royal heirloom. "Borrowing thread that already belongs to it," he said. He worked for 2 hours under a hand lens clamped to the edge of his bench, no machine, no court tools, just a needle so fine I could barely see it between his fingers, and the unraveled hem thread relayed stitch by stitch along the spiral the masters had called unrecoverable. He hummed while he worked, tunelessly, the way a man hums when his hands are doing something his mind trusts completely. Twice he stopped and held the lace to the window and turned it slowly, hunting the line where his new work met the old, and twice he made some adjustment too small for me to see and went back to it. I stayed the whole time. I told myself it was duty. It was not duty. I had simply never watched anyone work like that, with that particular quality of attention, as if the cloth in his hands were the only thing in the empire that mattered, which for those 2 hours, to him, it was. When he finished, there was no scar. I held it to 3 different lamps myself, the way Master Orvith had taught me to check 40 years ago, and I could not find the seam. The new thread did not sit on top of the old pattern. It had become the old pattern, the way a healed bone becomes stronger at the break. Vienna Thal wore it an hour later. She did not know, going in, that anything had happened to it at all. That had been my one mercy to her, to let her have the morning of her wedding without that fear added to it. She found out afterward, when I told her, because I could not let the day pass without her knowing whose hands had kept her mother's face in that light. She asked to see him. I expected her to send a steward. She went down to the mending deck herself, in her wedding dress, past 3 decks of crew who had never in their lives seen a Thal princess below the public levels, and she found Idris Calloway sitting at his bench taking in a tunic cuff as if nothing at all had happened that morning. I was there for what she said to him, so I will tell it exactly. She did not call him Master Tailor. She did not offer him a position in the Hall of Vows, though I believe she would have, had he wanted it. She said, "You held something my grandmother's hands made, and you gave it back to me whole. I asked the Crown's office this morning what was delaying your petition. There was no good reason. There is none now." He did not say much back. He is not a man who says much. He told her he was glad the veil had held, and that he hoped her marriage would too. And then, because she was still standing there in her wedding dress in a mending deck 3 levels below anywhere a princess belongs, he asked her, with perfect seriousness, whether she wanted him to take a look at the hem before the ceremony photographs, because he'd noticed it was sitting half a finger short on the left. She laughed. I had never heard her laugh like that, not once in 11 years of dressing her for state occasions. She let him kneel right there and fix it. His papers came through within the week. No fanfare, no announcement in the court record, nothing I could point to and call a reward, because he never asked for one and would not have taken it. He is still in the mending deck. He took in my own sleeve cuff last month without my asking, because he said he'd noticed it riding loose when I reached for the high shelves, and I let him, because by then I understood that this was simply the only way the man knew how to say the things other people say out loud. I think of it still, the evening I watched him take down 4 centuries of hidden thread with no more weight in his hands than a man fixing a boot. The masters had been right that the spiral could not be rewoven. They had simply never thought to ask whose hands were already quiet enough to be trusted with it.